When Robert was a kid, he had two dads. One was his real father, the one who worked for the government, had college degrees, and believed in getting a good job and working hard all your life. The other was the dad of his best friend Mike, a man who never finished school but owned businesses and became very rich. Robert calls them his poor dad and his rich dad, not because one was better, but because they thought about money in completely different ways. How this author describes this is like growing up with two voices in your head. One says, go to school, get good grades, find a safe job. The other says, learn how money works, make it work for you, and don't be afraid to take risks. That's how the lessons started. Not from textbooks, but from watching how both dads lived their lives and handled their money. Robert remembers a day when he asked his real dad how to become rich. His dad laughed a little and said, go to school, get a degree, and find a good company to work for. That's how people become successful. But that answer didn't sit right with Robert. So, he turned to Mike's dad. That man didn't give a lecture. He gave them a job in one of his stores, paying them 10 cents an hour. It wasn't about the money. It was about the lesson. At first, Robert thought it was unfair. Why work for so little? But that was the point. One day he told Rich Dad, this is like being a slave. I'm not even making real money. Rich Dad smiled and said, good. Now you're starting to learn. He explained that most people live their whole lives chasing money, scared of losing it, always needing more just to survive. If you let fear control you, money will always be your boss, he said. The moment you stop working only for money, you'll start to see how money can work for you. How this author describes this is like learning to see with new eyes. It wasn't just about saving or budgeting, it was about thinking differently. Robert's poor dad believed in playing it safe. Work, earn, spend, repeat. His rich dad believed in building businesses, investments, assets. One dad saw security in a paycheck. The other saw freedom in owning things that made money even when he wasn't working. Robert learned early that schools didn't teach these lessons. They taught you how to be an employee, not how to be financially smart. Rich Dad said, the school teaches you to be good at tests. Life teaches you through mistakes. Don't be afraid to make them. So instead of punishing failure, Rich Dad used it as a tool. Every time he lost money, he didn't panic. He learned. And he taught Robert to do the same. Robert also noticed how his two dads spoke differently. Poor Dad said things like, we can't afford that. Rich Dad said, how can we afford that? One shut down ideas. The other opened the door to possibilities. This simple change in thinking made all the difference. It trained Robert to ask better questions and look for solutions instead of excuses. The most powerful lesson Robert got from Rich Dad was this: don't just work for money. Build something that keeps earning for you even when you're not working. Whether it was real estate, stocks, or a business, Rich Dad focused on assets, things that put money in your pocket. Poor Dad had liabilities. Things like a big house, a new car, that looked like success but actually took money out every month. This way of seeing the world changed everything for Robert. He started to realize that being rich wasn't just about having money. It was about understanding money. It was about controlling it instead of being controlled by it. And most of all, it was about learning to think like Rich Dad. As Robert grew older, the difference between his two dads became even clearer. Poor Dad got promoted, earned more money, and moved into a bigger house, but somehow still worried about bills. Rich Dad, on the other hand, didn't talk much about raises or promotions. He talked about buying things that made money for him, like a rental property or a small business or even stocks. And Robert started to understand what that really meant. How this author describes this change in thinking is like flipping a light switch. Most people earn money and then spend it. They pay the bills, maybe save a little, then start over next month. But Rich Dad explained something different. Use your money to buy or build something that keeps making money for you. That way, over time, your money works harder than you do. One day, Rich Dad told Robert and Mike, "Look, the poor and middle class work for money. The rich make money work for them." That one sentence stayed with Robert forever. It wasn't just a catchy quote, it was the foundation of how rich people think. Poor Dad believed the key was education. Rich Dad believed the key was financial education. How this author describes the idea of financial education is simple. Learn what money really is, how it flows, and how to control it. Not in a complicated, Wall Street kind of way, but in an everyday kind of way. Things like, what's an asset? What's a liability? Most people confuse the two. They think their house is an asset just because it's worth a lot. But Rich Dad said, if it takes money out of your pocket every month, it's a liability. If it puts money in your pocket, it's an asset. So, Robert learned that owning a fancy car or a big house didn't make someone rich. Sometimes it just made them broke in a nicer zip code. Rich people, the truly wealthy ones, focused on buying assets, things that earn money on their own. Rental properties, dividend-paying stocks, small businesses. These were the tools of wealth. And this wasn't just theory. Rich Dad would show them real-life examples. He'd take Robert to his businesses, show him the books, explain how he bought property, how he negotiated deals, how he paid himself last and reinvested his profit. Poor Dad never did that. He was honest and hardworking, but he played the game the way everyone else did. Get a job, earn money, spend it, hope for retirement. Robert remembers asking Rich Dad once, "But isn't it risky to invest in stuff like that?" Rich Dad looked at him and said, "Isn't it risky to depend on one job for your whole life?" That hit hard. Poor Dad thought working for a stable company was the safest path. But Rich Dad saw depending on one paycheck as dangerous. What if the company goes under? What if you get sick? What if inflation eats your savings? So, instead of depending on one stream of income, Rich Dad taught Robert to build many. Don't put all your eggs in one basket, he said. Build a farm of chickens, each laying eggs. If one stops, you still eat. It made sense. It was simple. And it was something schools never taught. How this author describes financial success is not as luck, but as preparation. Rich Dad said, opportunities are everywhere. The question is, are you ready for them? That's why he always encouraged learning, not just book smarts but street smarts. Learn how to sell, how to communicate, how to negotiate, how to read financial statements. These are the real-life skills, he said. Not just memorizing facts for a test. Robert began to notice that rich people weren't always the smartest or most educated in the traditional sense, but they understood money. They understood how to turn ideas into income. They used debt as a tool instead of something to fear. They didn't just buy nice things. They bought income first, then used that income to buy nice things. And most importantly, they kept learning. Rich Dad read books, attended meetings, asked questions, took risks. He never claimed to know everything, but he was always curious. Poor Dad, though proud of his degrees, often felt stuck. He didn't like talking about money. It made him uncomfortable. So, he avoided it. And that, Robert saw, was a huge difference. Rich Dad talked about money like it was a game you could learn to play. Poor Dad treated it like a burden you had to carry. As Robert stepped into his teenage years, he started to test what he was learning. He watched how his two dads made choices with their money, time, and energy. Poor Dad would say things like, "I can't afford that," or "We don't talk about money at the table." Rich Dad would challenge those ideas by saying, "Talk about money more often, not less. That's how you learn. And never say you can't afford something. Ask how you can afford it." How this author describes this is like learning a new language. It wasn't about numbers. It was about confidence. It was about learning how to think differently and not be afraid of looking dumb when asking questions about money. Robert remembers going to a store once and seeing a cool new gadget he wanted. His real dad said, "That's too expensive. Don't waste your time dreaming." But Rich Dad looked at the same thing and said, "Good. It's expensive. Now, how do you plan to buy it? What can you build or sell to earn that money? One answer shut down the dream. The other sparked curiosity. And that's what Rich Dad always did. He made Robert think. He didn't give handouts. He gave questions. What's your plan? What's your next move? How can you turn that idea into income? Robert began looking at the world differently. Instead of just being a consumer, he started thinking like a creator. He started small, reselling comic books, collecting soda caps to trade for prizes, running errands for neighbors. He realized money didn't only come from a job. It could come from solving problems, filling needs, or being creative. How this author describes the idea of entrepreneurship is very simple. Start where you are with what you have and look for ways to add value. Rich Dad would say, don't just think about working for money, think about creating value. When you help others, money follows. This was totally different from what Robert heard in school, where the goal seemed to be memorizing facts and getting good grades, not learning how to build a life of freedom. Rich Dad also explained taxes and how the rich legally avoid paying too much. That blew Robert's mind. Poor Dad thought paying a lot in taxes meant you were doing your part. Rich Dad thought it meant you didn't understand the rules of the game. The rich use corporations, deductions, and smart planning, he said. They use the law to protect themselves. The poor and middle class pay more because they don't know how the system works. It wasn't about cheating, it was about being educated. How this author describes smart money management is like playing a sport. If you don't know the rules, you can't win. Rich Dad studied those rules. He hired accountants and lawyers who understood how to build wealth legally and safely. Poor Dad didn't trust those people. He thought they were just out to take money. That's when Robert realized, it's not about working harder, it's about working smarter. Rich Dad didn't brag about how hard he worked. In fact, he worked less than most people. But he spent his time learning, thinking, and building systems that kept earning. His businesses ran even when he wasn't there. His real estate properties paid him every month, and he reinvested those earnings to grow even more. Poor Dad, though highly educated, had only one stream of income, his job. And when that job was gone, so was the income. Rich Dad had many streams. That gave him freedom. He didn't panic if one thing failed. He had options. Robert also saw how differently his two dads viewed mistakes. Poor Dad was afraid of being wrong, afraid of failing. Rich Dad welcomed mistakes. Every failure is a lesson, he said. Fail small. Learn fast. Keep going. That gave Robert courage. He stopped being scared of trying new things. He started to see mistakes not as proof he wasn't smart, but as part of learning. Over time, these ideas became part of who Robert was. He didn't just admire Rich Dad, he began to think like him. He read books Rich Dad recommended, listened to business conversations, asked questions about taxes, investing, cash flow. And slowly, he started making his own money in smarter ways. How this author describes the shift is very human. It's about choosing what kind of future you want. Do you want to work all your life, hoping to retire someday? Or do you want to build something that gives you choices, freedom, and peace of mind? Robert chose the second path. And it started by thinking differently, listening to the right mentor, and never being afraid to ask, is there a better way? By the time Robert was a young adult, the voices of his two dads still echoed in his head. But now, he could clearly see which one made more sense for the life he wanted. Poor Dad's voice was still filled with fear. What if you fail? What if you don't find a stable job? What if people think you're being reckless? Rich Dad's voice was full of calm certainty. Take a smart risk. Learn from every setback. Money is just a tool. Learn how to use it. How this author describes this phase of life is not as a grand moment, but as a steady turning point. Robert didn't suddenly become rich. He made choices, one at a time, based on what he had learned. He bought small rental properties, started small businesses, and paid attention to where his money was going. He made mistakes, but unlike most people, He didn't quit after failing. He adjusted, learned, and tried again. One thing Rich Dad always stressed was this: build assets first. Don't spend all your money on things that look good but don't earn anything, he'd say. Buy something that gives you cash every month. Then, if you want the nice car or the big vacation, use that cash, not your job income. Robert followed that advice. Before he bought nice clothes or a new gadget, he asked himself, will this put money in my pocket or take it out? It wasn't easy. Most people around him were doing the opposite, spending more than they earned, taking out loans to buy stuff that lost value, and hoping they could work long enough to pay it all off. Robert saw them getting trapped, good jobs, high paychecks, and still broke. That's when he truly understood what Rich Dad meant when he said, "The rat race isn't about money. It's about habits." How this author describes financial freedom is simple. It means having enough assets to cover your living expenses without having to work for someone else. That's it. It doesn't mean being a millionaire or living in a mansion. It means having choices. Robert saw that his rich dad had that freedom. He could choose how to spend his day, what projects to work on, when to rest, and when to help others. That freedom came from building assets over time, not by luck, but with a plan. He also noticed something else. Rich Dad didn't just care about money. He cared about legacy. He taught Robert to think beyond himself. Teach others, he said. The more you share what you learn, the more you understand it. And the more you help others become free, the stronger you all become. That's why Robert started writing and speaking. He wanted to pass on the lessons that changed his life. Poor Dad meant well. He was kind, hardworking, and honest. But he stayed stuck in a system that didn't reward those qualities with freedom. Rich Dad took risks, read financial statements like they were novels, and made his money do the work. Robert took both men's lessons seriously, but it was Rich Dad's approach that led to wealth, independence, and eventually teaching others. Looking back, Robert is grateful for both dads. One showed him what most of the world believes: study hard, get a job, retire later. The other showed him what the wealthy understand: study money, take control, and build something of your own. That contrast gave him the choice. And that choice made all the difference. How this author describes the key to wealth is not about finding the perfect investment or winning the lottery. It's about changing how you think. Ask better questions. Learn what schools don't teach. Don't fear money, understand it. And most of all, remember that the path to financial freedom doesn't start with money. It starts with your mind. Robert now teaches others what he learned, hoping to be the rich dad in their lives. Because once you understand how money works, you can never see the world the same way again. You begin to see opportunities, not obstacles, choices, not limits, and most importantly, you begin to believe that you can build the life you really want.